The leather-bound book trembled in Helena Thatcher's hands as the stagecoach lurched over another rutted patch of road. The New Mexico territory stretching endlessly outside the dusty window like a sea of ochre and sage. She kept her eyes fixed on the familiar words of the fairy tale, though she had read them so many times she could recite them from memory, because looking at the pages meant she did not have to look at the uncertainty waiting for her in Montezuma. The princess in the story was about to be rescued by her handsome prince, and Helena felt a bitter twist in her chest at the contrast between ink and parchment dreams, and the harsh reality of traveling alone to take a position as a schoolteacher in a town she had never seen. The year was 1878, and respectable women did not travel unaccompanied across territories. But Helena had little choice after her father's death. 6 months prior had left her with nothing but debts, and the education he had insisted she receive. Her mother had died when she was 12, and her father, a professor in Boston, had raised her on literature and Latin, philosophy and mathematics, never imagining that his investment in her mind would become her only means of survival. The teaching position in Montezuma had arrived like a miracle, though Helena suspected miracles were in short supply this far west. She was 22 years old, tall and slender with dark chestnut hair she kept in a practical bun and gray eyes that her father had once called storm-colored. Her traveling dress was a deep blue, already showing the dust of the journey, and she clutched her small carpet-bag containing everything she owned along with the book of fairy tales. The other passengers, a stern-faced merchant and his wife, had made it clear they found her situation irregular, and their cold silence had driven her deeper into her reading. The stagecoach hit another bump, and Helena's book slipped from her fingers, landing at the feet of the merchant's wife, who looked at it as though it might contain plague. Helena leaned forward to retrieve it, murmuring an apology, but the woman merely sniffed and turned her face to the window. Helena felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and anger, and she clutched the book tighter when she had it back in her hands. Outside, the landscape was beginning to change as they approached the foothills. The town of Montezuma sat in the northern part of the territory, not far from the Colorado border, and the agent in Santa Fe who had arranged her passage had warned her it was rough country, populated by ranchers, miners, and men trying to outrun their pasts. He had looked at her with something between pity and concern, but Helena had squared her shoulders and assured him she would manage. She always managed. The stagecoach rolled into Montezuma just as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. Helena pressed her face to the window, taking in her first glimpse of what would be her home. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with wooden buildings that looked as though they had been thrown up in haste. She could see a general store, a saloon with painted letters proclaiming it the Golden Nugget, a bank, a hotel, and at the far end, a small white building with a bell that she hoped was the schoolhouse. The stagecoach pulled to a stop in front of the hotel, and the driver climbed down to help his passengers disembark. The merchant and his wife practically fled, leaving Helena to gather her things alone. She stepped down onto the wooden walkway, her legs unsteady after so many hours of travel, and looked around with what she hoped was confidence rather than the anxiety churning in her stomach. A man was supposed to meet her, the school board president, a Mr. whoever the letter had said. But Helena's attention was caught instead by the cowboy leaning against the post outside the saloon, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of hard work and harder living. His hat was pushed back far enough that she could see dark hair and a face that was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all strong jaw and high cheekbones, with eyes that even at this distance seemed to see right through her. Helena lifted her chin and looked away, determined not to appear intimidated. She had dealt with plenty of men in Boston who thought a woman alone was an invitation, and she would deal with them here too. She clutched her carpet bag and her book and waited, hoping someone would approach who looked official. The cowboy pushed off from the post and started walking toward her. Helena's heart began to beat faster, but she held her ground, preparing to deliver a cutting set down if necessary. He moved with an easy grace despite his size, and as he got closer, she could see his eyes were a striking blue-green, the color of deep water. "Miss Thatcher." His voice was low and rough, like whiskey over gravel, but there was nothing threatening in his tone. "I am Zachary Young. The school board sent me to meet you and show you to your lodgings." Helena felt her carefully prepared defenses falter. "You are with the school board." A hint of something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "Not exactly. I am the foreman at the Double R Ranch just outside town. The school board president, Mr. Carson, took ill yesterday and his wife asked if I would help out. I hope my presence is not too irregular." "This entire situation is irregular," Helena said before she could stop herself, then felt heat rise in her cheeks again. "I apologize. That was rude. It is kind of you to assist. No apology needed." Zachary reached for her carpet bag. "May I?" Helena hesitated, then allowed him to take the bag, keeping her book clutched against her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Young." "Zach," he said, "most folks around here do not stand much on formality. Then you may call me Helena." The moment she said it, she wondered if she was being too familiar, but something about the way he looked at her, direct and honest, made the formal distance seem silly. Zach led her down the main street, pointing out the various buildings as they walked. The hotel was run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson who, according to Zach, made the best apple pie in 3 territories. The general store was owned by the Miller family, who had 6 children, all of whom would be Helena's students. The doctor's office was above the barber shop and the sheriff's office was next to the bank. "And that is the schoolhouse," Zach said, gesturing to the white building Helena had spotted from the stagecoach. "Classes start Monday. You have got 3 days to settle in and prepare." Helena looked at the building with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "How many students?" "About 20, ranging from 6 to 15. Some of the ranch families bring their children in when they can spare them from work, so the number varies." He glanced at her, and she thought she saw concern in his expression. "It is not an easy job. The last teacher left after 2 months." "Why?" Helena asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Said the children were too wild, the parents too demanding, and the isolation too much to bear. Zach's tone was neutral, but Helena could hear the criticism beneath it. "In my opinion, she was not cut out for frontier life." "And you think I am not either?" Helena heard the defensiveness in her own voice and hated it. Zach stopped walking and turned to face her fully. They were standing in front of a small but neat cottage set back from the main street, with a tiny garden plot in front and lace curtains in the windows. "I think," he said slowly, "that you have got more steel in your spine than she did. I saw it the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, the way you looked around like you were measuring everything and finding your place in it. But I also think you are scared, and that is all right. This is a hard land, and anyone with sense would be scared." Helena found herself staring at him, surprised by his perceptiveness and his honesty. "I am terrified," she admitted, the words escaping before she could think better of them. "But I have nowhere else to go, so I suppose I had better make the best of it." "This is your house," Zach said, nodding toward the cottage. It belongs to the school, comes with the position. It is furnished, and Mrs. Patterson said she stocked the pantry with basics. If you need anything, the school board has set up an account for you at the general store. Helena looked at the cottage and felt something in her chest loosen. It was small, but it looked clean and well-maintained, and it was hers, at least for as long as she could keep the teaching position. It is lovely. Let me show you inside. Zach opened the gate and led her up the path to the front door, producing a key from his pocket. The door swung open to reveal a main room that served as both sitting area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, and a small stove. Through an open doorway, Helena could see a bedroom with a simple iron bed covered in a colorful quilt. The previous teacher left some things, Zach said, setting Helena's carpetbag on the table. Books for teaching, slates, chalk, that sort of thing. Mrs. Carson will come by tomorrow to go over everything with you. Thank you, Mr. Young. Zach. Helena set her book of fairy tales on the table beside her carpetbag and looked around her new home, trying to imagine herself living here, making meals at that stove, sleeping in that bed, building a life in this strange place. I will leave you to settle in, Zach said, but he did not move toward the door. Instead, he looked at the book on the table, and Helena saw his expression soften. Fairytales. Helena felt defensive again, expecting mockery. Yes, they were my mother's. I know they are foolish, but I like them. I do not think they are foolish. Zach reached out and gently touched the worn leather cover. My sister used to read them before she died. She would sit by the fire in our parents' house in Missouri and read them aloud to anyone who would listen. I must have heard Cinderella 100 times. The pain in his voice was old but still real, and Helena felt her defenses crumble completely. I am sorry, she said softly. How old was she? 10. Fever took her 12 years ago. Zach pulled his hand back from the book. Our parents passed not long after, and I came west. Been here ever since. So you understand about losing family, Helena said, and it was not a question. I do. Zach met her eyes, and the connection between them felt sudden and strong, two people who had known loss recognizing it in each other. If you need anything, Helena, anything at all, the Double R is about 3 miles north of town. Anyone can give you directions, or you can leave a message at the general store and I will get it next time I am in town. Why are you being so kind to me? Helena asked, genuinely curious. Zach smiled, and it transformed his face from handsome to something that made Helena's breath catch. Because you look like you could use a friend, and because anyone who still reads fairy tales after everything life throws at them is someone worth knowing. He tipped his hat and left before Helena could formulate a response. She stood in the middle of her new home, listening to his footsteps fade away, and wondered what she had just gotten herself into. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Carson, a bustling woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a practical manner, came by as promised and walked Helena through her duties. The school day would run from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, 5 days a week. Helena would be expected to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography to students of varying ages and abilities, all in one room. The salary was modest but fair, and as long as the parents were satisfied with her teaching, the position was secure. Helena spent her evenings going through the teaching materials and her days exploring Montezuma. The town was small but growing, with new buildings going up seemingly every week. She met the Millers at the general store, a friendly couple who welcomed her warmly and introduced her to their children, who ranged from 7 to 14. She met Dr. Harrison, an elderly man who had practiced medicine in Philadelphia before retiring west for his health. She met Sheriff Daniels, a laconic man in his 30s who seemed competent if not particularly friendly. And everywhere she went, people asked about Zach Young. Had he been helpful? Was he not a fine man? Did she know he had been foreman of the Double R for 6 years and had saved the ranch from bankruptcy with his hard work and smart management? The questions made Helena realize that Zach was well regarded in Montezuma, which made his kindness to her feel less random and more significant. She did not see him again during those 3 days, though she found herself looking for him each time she walked down the main street. She told herself it was only because he was the one familiar face in this sea of strangers, but she knew she was lying. Monday morning arrived with cloudless blue skies and Helena's stomach in knots. She dressed carefully in a sensible brown dress with a white collar, pinned her hair into a neat bun, and walked to the schoolhouse with her book of fairy tales tucked under her arm. She did not know why she had brought it, only that holding it made her feel less alone. The schoolhouse was a single large room with rows of wooden desks, a blackboard at the front, and windows along both sides that let in the morning light. Helena's desk sat on a small raised platform, and behind it was a bookshelf with various texts and supplies. She arranged her things, wrote her name on the blackboard, and waited. The children began arriving at 7:30, brought by parents who eyed Helena with curiosity and varying degrees of skepticism. She greeted each family, shook hands, learned names, and tried to project confidence she did not feel. By 8:05, she had 19 students ranging from 6-year-old twins named Sarah and Samuel to 15-year-old John, who towered over her and looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. Helena took a deep breath, smiled at the assembled children, and began. "Good morning. My name is Miss Thatcher, and I am very pleased to be your teacher. I know I am new here and you are all wondering what sort of teacher I will be, so let me tell you. I believe education is a gift, perhaps the greatest gift anyone can receive. I will work hard to teach you, and I will expect you to work hard to learn. I will be fair, I will be patient, but I will not tolerate meanness or laziness. Does everyone understand?" Most of the children nodded. John crossed his arms and stared at the ceiling. Helena decided to ignore him for now. The morning went better than she had dared hope. The younger children were eager and attentive, thrilled to be learning their letters and numbers. The middle group, ages 9 to 12, were more challenging, testing her boundaries with whispers and giggles, but Helena managed them with a firm voice and a few strategic separations. Only John remained stubbornly disengaged, slumped at his desk in the back row, doing nothing. At noon, Helena dismissed the children for lunch. Most of them scattered outside to eat under the shade of the cottonwood trees, but a few of the younger ones lingered, curious about the book on Helena's desk. "What is that, Miss Thatcher?" asked Sarah, one of the twins, pointing to the fairy tale book. Helena picked it up and showed them the cover. "It is a book of stories, fairy tales. Would you read us one?" Samuel asked, his eyes wide with interest. Helena hesitated, then nodded. "If you eat your lunch quickly and come back inside, I will read you a story before afternoon lessons begin." The children scattered to eat, and Helena opened her book to one of her favorites, The Story of the Princess and the Pea, a tale about true nobility revealing itself through sensitivity and honesty. She was so absorbed in rereading the familiar words that she did not notice someone had entered the schoolhouse until a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to find Zach standing there, hat in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable in the school setting. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all." Helena stood, smoothing her skirt, acutely aware of how plain she must look in her brown dress with chalk dust on her sleeves. "What brings you to town? Ranch business at the bank. I thought I would stop by and see how your first morning went." Zach glanced around the empty schoolroom. No casualties, so I assume it went well. Helena laughed, surprised by how good it felt. "It went better than expected, though I have one student who seems determined to make my life difficult." "John Peterson," Zach guessed. "How did you know?" "His father died last year, and his mother is struggling to keep their farm going. John thinks he should be home helping instead of wasting time in school." Zach's expression was sympathetic. "He is not a bad kid, just angry at the world." "I understand angry," Helena said quietly. "I will find a way to reach him." Zach smiled that smile that made her breath catch. "I believe you will." His eyes fell on the book in her hands. "Reading fairy tales to yourself," to the children actually. The younger ones asked, and I thought it might be nice. Helena felt defensive again, waiting for him to tell her it was a waste of educational time. Instead, Zach's smile widened. "That is a fine idea. Everyone needs stories, especially out here where life can be pretty grim." The children began filtering back into the schoolroom, chattering excitedly when they saw Zach. Apparently, he was a popular figure, and several of the boys rushed over to ask about the horses at the Double R, and whether he had seen any wild mustangs lately. Zach answered patiently, tousling hair and teasing gently, and Helena watched him with something warm unfurling in her chest. When the children had settled at their desks, Zach tipped his hat to Helena. "I will let you get back to teaching. But if you have got a moment after school, I would like to talk to you about something." "Of course." Helena tried to keep her voice casual, but her heart was beating faster. Zach left, and Helena turned to face her students, trying to focus on the lesson ahead. But part of her mind was occupied with wondering what Zach wanted to talk about, and why the prospect of seeing him again made her feel like a character in one of her fairy tales. The afternoon lessons went smoothly, and at 3 o'clock, Helena dismissed the children. Most of them scattered immediately, but Sarah and Samuel lingered, reminding Helena of her promise to read a story. Helena settled them at the front desks and opened her book, reading the tale of the princess and the pea in a clear, expressive voice. By the time she finished, several other children had crept back in to listen, including, to her surprise, John Peterson, who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed but his eyes fixed on her face. When she closed the book, the children applauded, and Helena felt a rush of warmth and accomplishment. "Tomorrow I will read another, if you would like." The children agreed enthusiastically and finally departed, leaving Helena alone in the schoolhouse to tidy up and prepare for the next day. She was erasing the blackboard when Zach returned, knocking politely on the door frame even though the door was open. "Come in," Helena called, setting down the eraser and dusting off her hands. Zach entered and stood awkwardly for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I have got a proposition for you, and I want you to know you can say no without any hard feelings." Helena felt a flutter of nervousness. "All right. The Double R is having a barn raising this Saturday. The old barn roof collapsed under snow last winter, and we are finally getting around to fixing it properly. The whole county will be there, helping out and socializing. It is a good opportunity for you to meet more of the families whose children you will be teaching, and for them to get to know you." Zach paused, then continued in a rush. "I would like to escort you if you are willing. It would be proper, you would not be arriving alone, and I could introduce you around." Helena's first instinct was to refuse. She barely knew this man, and accepting his escort felt like stepping over some invisible line. But then she thought about arriving alone at a social event where she knew almost no one, and about how kind Zach had been to her, and about how much she enjoyed his company in the brief times they had spoken. "I would like that," she heard herself say. "Thank you for asking." Zach's face lit up with a smile that made Helena's stomach flip. "I will pick you up Saturday morning at 8. It is a bit of a ride to the ranch, but the weather should be fine. Wear something you do not mind getting dusty." "I will." Helena smiled back, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other until Helena remembered herself and turned back to the blackboard. "I should finish cleaning up." "Right. I will see you Saturday then." Zach settled his hat on his head and left, and Helena stood alone in the schoolroom, wondering what she had just agreed to and why the prospect of Saturday felt like Christmas and her birthday combined. The rest of the week passed in a pleasant rhythm of teaching and settling into her new life. The children were warming to her, even John, who had started at least pretending to pay attention during lessons. Helena established routines, learned personalities, and began to feel like perhaps she could make a success of this position after all. The parents who stopped by to check on their children seemed satisfied, and Mrs. Carson visited mid-week to express the school board's approval. Helena spent her evenings reading by lamplight, cooking simple meals, and exploring the area around her cottage. Montezuma was beautiful in its own stark way, with the mountains rising in the distance and the sky so vast, it made her feel small and significant all at once. She thought about Boston, about her father's house with its cramped rooms and musty books, and realized with some surprise that she did not miss it. Saturday arrived bright and clear, and Helena dressed in her oldest day dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was still serviceable. She pinned her hair in a simple braid and tried not to think about the fact that she was essentially going on an outing with Zach Young, a man she had known for less than 2 weeks, but who occupied her thoughts far more than was proper. Zach arrived promptly at 8, driving a wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. He hopped down and came to her door, looking handsome in dark trousers, a clean shirt, and a vest. His hat was pushed back, and his eyes were bright with what looked like anticipation. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Helena confirmed, locking her cottage door and allowing Zach to help her up onto the wagon seat. The ride to the Double R took about 40 minutes, following a well-worn road that cut through scrubland and alongside a creek that Zach said ran year-round. He pointed out landmarks, told her about the history of the area, and asked about her week of teaching. Helena found herself relaxing, enjoying the conversation and the beautiful morning. Zach was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in what she had to say, and their exchanges felt natural in a way that surprised her. "I have been thinking about your fairy tales," Zach said as they neared the ranch, "about how in all of them the princess gets rescued by a prince." "Do you ever wish life worked that way?" Helena considered the question. "Sometimes, but I think real life is more complicated than fairy tales. Real people are more complicated." "That is true enough." Zach glanced at her. "But everyone wants a happy ending, do they not? A sense that things will work out all right in the end." "I suppose so. I just do not think happy endings come from being rescued. I think they come from making choices and working hard and maybe getting a little lucky." Helena looked out at the landscape. "Though I will admit, a handsome prince would not hurt." Zach laughed, a rich, warm sound. "Well, I cannot promise you a prince, but I can promise you good food and decent company today." The Double R came into view over a rise, and Helena caught her breath at the sight. The ranch house was a large, sprawling structure of wood and stone, with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning sun. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the property, and dozens of people were already gathered around what would be the new barn, their wagons and horses creating a small village. Zach drove the wagon to a spot near the house and helped Helena down. Immediately, they were surrounded by people, all curious about the new schoolteacher. Zach stayed close, making introductions, his hand occasionally resting lightly on the small of Helena's back in a gesture that felt both protective and proprietary. Helena met the ranch owner, Mr. Randolph, a gruff but kind man in his 60s who thanked her for taking the teaching position. She met his wife, who insisted Helena call her Dorothy and promised to send over some preserves. She met ranch hands, neighboring ranchers, farmers from the outskirts of Montezuma, and more children who would be her students. The work of raising the barn began in earnest around 9, with the men swarming over the structure like ants, hammering and sawing and calling instructions to each other. The women gathered in the shade of the ranch house porch, preparing the midday meal and watching the children play. Helena found herself pulled into the group, given a knife and a pile of potatoes to peel and bombarded with friendly questions. "How are you finding Montezuma?" Mrs. Miller asked. "It is an adjustment, but I am managing," Helena replied honestly. "And Zach Young?" Another woman asked with a sly smile. "He seems quite attentive." Helena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He has been very kind in helping me settle in." "Zach is a good man," Dorothy Randolph said firmly, giving the other woman a quelling look. "He has worked for my husband for 6 years and never caused a moment of trouble. He is steady, reliable, and decent. Any woman would be lucky to have his attention." The other women murmured agreement, and Helena focused on her potatoes, trying to sort through her feelings. Did she want Zach's attention? The answer, she realized with some surprise, was yes. She did. She enjoyed his company, found him handsome and kind, and felt something when she was near him that she had never felt with any of the proper Boston men her father had introduced her to over the years. But wanting and having were two different things, and Helena had no idea if Zach saw her as anything more than a new member of the community who needed a helping hand. At noon, the work stopped for the meal, and Helena found herself sitting beside Zach at one of the long tables set up in the yard. The food was simple but plentiful: roasted chicken, potatoes, biscuits, beans, and an array of pies and cakes for dessert. The conversation was lively, full of jokes and stories, and Helena felt more relaxed than she had in months. After the meal, the men returned to work and the women to their tasks, but Zach caught Helena's hand before she could follow the other women. "Take a walk with me. I want to show you something." Helena nodded, ignoring the knowing looks from the other women, and followed Zach away from the bustle of the barn raising. He led her past the corrals, where horses whinnied and stamped, and up a small hill that overlooked the entire ranch. At the top, he stopped and gestured to the view. "This is my favorite spot on the whole property," he said. "I come up here when I need to think." Helena could see why. The view was breathtaking, the ranch spread out below them and the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow. The sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the breeze carried the scent of sage and sunshine. "It is beautiful," Helena said softly. "I wanted to bring you up here because I wanted to talk to you properly, away from everyone else." Zach turned to face her, his expression serious. "I know we have not known each other long, Helena, but I feel like I need to be honest with you about something." Helena's heart began to race. "All right." "I have not stopped thinking about you since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach," Zach said, his voice low and intense. "I told myself it was just because you were new and needed help, but that is not true. The truth is, I think you are remarkable. You are smart and brave, and you read fairy tales even though life has been hard on you, and that tells me you have not given up on hope. I do not have much to offer. I am just a ranch foreman, not a prince from one of your stories. But if you will let me, I would like to court you properly. I would like to see if maybe we could build something together." Helena stared at him, her mind reeling. In her fairy tales, this was the moment where the princess would swoon or blush and accept immediately. But this was real life, and Helena needed to be sure. "Why me?" she asked. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Zach said. "I know you are kind because I saw how you talked to those children at the schoolhouse. I know you are strong because you came out here alone with no safety net. I know you are honest because you admitted you were scared instead of pretending to be fearless. And I know that when you smile, really smile, it feels like the sun coming out." He paused, then added with a slight smile of his own, "And you like fairy tales, which means you believe in happy endings, and I could use some of that belief in my life." Helena felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by his words and the sincerity in his face. "I do not know how to do this," she admitted. "I have never been courted before. My father was protective, and then he was sick, and then he was gone, and I have just been trying to survive." "Then let me help you do more than survive," Zach said gently. "Let me show you what it is like to build a life instead of just enduring one." Helena thought about her cottage, her students, the future she was trying to create in Montezuma. She thought about how lonely she had been, how scared, and how Zach made her feel less alone. She thought about fairy tales and happy endings, and the difference between being rescued and choosing to let someone stand beside you. "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. "Yes, I would like that." Zach's face broke into a grin, and before Helena could react, he stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. She stiffened for a moment, surprised, then relaxed into his embrace, feeling the warmth and strength of him, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. When he pulled back, his hands lingered on her shoulders and his eyes searched her face. "I am going to do right by you, Helena Thatcher," he said. "I promise you that." "I believe you," Helena said, and realized she meant it. They walked back down the hill hand in hand, and if the assembled crowd noticed and exchanged knowing looks, Helena found she did not care. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she was not just surviving but actually living, and the feeling was intoxicating. The next several weeks fell into a pattern that felt both new and comfortable. Zach came to town every Saturday, ostensibly on ranch business, but he always made time to see Helena. Sometimes they went for walks, sometimes they sat on her porch and talked, and once he brought her to a dance in the town hall where he taught her to two-step and made her laugh until her sides ached. The people of Montezuma watched their courtship with approval, and Helena found herself welcomed more warmly into the community as Zach's chosen woman. Teaching continued to go well. Helena had found her rhythm with the children, and even John Peterson had thought enough to participate in lessons. She continued to read fairy tales during lunch, and the tradition became a favorite part of the school day for students and teacher alike. Sometimes, when she was reading about a princess finding her prince or a happy ending emerging from struggle, she would look up and catch one of the children watching her with rapt attention, and she would feel a surge of satisfaction that she was giving them something beyond just reading and arithmetic. One evening in mid-October, Zach arrived at her cottage with a serious expression that made Helena's stomach clench with worry. "What is wrong?" she asked as soon as she opened the door. "Nothing is wrong exactly," Zach said, stepping inside when she gestured him in. "But I need to talk to you about something important." They sat at her small table, and Zach took her hands in his thumbs stroking her knuckles in a gesture that had become familiar over the weeks. "Mr. Randolph is planning to retire next year," he said. "He has asked me to take over running the Double R with the option to buy the ranch over time." Helena's eyes widened. "Zach, that is wonderful. You would own the ranch. Eventually, yes. It would take years to pay off, but it is a real opportunity." Zach paused, his expression uncertain. "But it would also mean more responsibility, longer hours, and less time to come to town. And I wanted to know how you felt about that before I gave him an answer." Helena's heart swelled at the fact that he was considering her feelings in such a major decision. "How I feel about it? Zach, this is your future. You cannot let me influence something so important." "You are my future," Zach said simply. "At least, I hope you are. I know we have only been courting a couple of months, but I am a straightforward man, Helena. I do not play games or waste time. I love you. I think I have loved you since I saw you on that stagecoach with your fairy tale book, looking scared and brave all at once. And if I am going to take on the ranch, I want to know that I am building something for us, not just for me." Helena felt tears spill over and did not bother to wipe them away. "You love me." "I do." Zach reached up to cup her face, his touch gentle. "I love how smart you are and how kind. I love that you read stories to children and believe in happy endings. I love your courage and your honesty and the way you laugh when something really amuses you. I love you, Helena Thatcher, and I am asking if you think you could love me too." "I already do," Helena whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to be sensible and practical, but I do. I love you, Zach Young." Zach leaned forward and kissed her, soft and sweet at first, then deeper as Helena responded, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. It was her first real kiss, and it felt like every fairy tale promise she had ever read, like magic and inevitability all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I know you probably want a long engagement and a fancy wedding, but marry me, Helena. Let me be your happy ending." Helena laughed through her tears at the echo of fairytale language. "You are not my ending," she said, pulling back to look at him directly. "You are my beginning. And yes, I will marry you." Zach whooped and pulled her into another kiss, then stood and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with joy. "I will talk to the preacher tomorrow. We can be married as soon as you want. What about the school board?" Helena asked, suddenly practical. "Will they let me keep teaching if I am married?" "We will make it work," Zach promised. "Even if you have to quit teaching, we will find something else. But I think if we talk to them, we can arrange for you to keep the position, at least until children come along." Children. The word sent a thrill through Helena, the idea of a future that included not just her and Zach, but a family they would build together. "I want to keep teaching as long as I can," she said. "Those children need me. Then we will make it happen." Zach kissed her again, quick and firm. "I should go. If I stay any longer, people will talk, and I want to do this right." He headed for the door, then turned back. "I will pick you up Sunday morning for church. We can tell everyone then." "All right." Helena walked him to the door, reluctant to let him go. Zach paused on the threshold and looked back at her, his expression tender. "You know what the best part of all this is?" "What?" "You were sitting there reading fairy tales to yourself, probably thinking they were just stories. And then I got to walk in and say, 'Let me be your happy ending.' Except it is not an ending at all. It is the start of everything." He left, and Helena stood in her doorway, watching him ride away into the dusk, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She went back inside and picked up her book of fairy tales, running her fingers over the worn cover. Her mother had read these stories, and her father had kept them for her. And now she was living her own version, complete with a handsome cowboy and a future bright with possibility. The news of their engagement spread through Montezuma like wildfire. By Monday morning, every student in Helena's school knew their teacher was going to marry Zach Young, and they greeted her with excited chatter and 100 questions. Helena found herself blushing and smiling more than teaching, but she did not mind. The joy was infectious. The school board met that week, and to Helena's relief, agreed to let her continue teaching after her marriage, at least until a family made it impractical. They would need to hire someone to take over the cottage, as Helena would be living at the Double R, but that was a small matter. Helena threw herself into planning, balancing her teaching duties with preparations for the wedding. She and Zach decided on a date 3 weeks away, the first Saturday in November. It would be a simple ceremony in the town church, followed by a celebration at the Double R. Dorothy Randolph insisted on hosting, and the women of Montezuma rallied around Helena, helping her sew a wedding dress from white muslin and lace that Mrs. Miller had been saving for something special. The weeks flew by in a whirl of activity and happiness. Zach came to town as often as he could, helping Helena pack up the cottage and move her few belongings to the ranch. He introduced her to the ranch hands, all of whom treated her with respect and friendliness. He showed her the ranch house, which would be theirs once the Randolphs moved to the smaller foreman's cottage, and asked her opinion on everything from curtains to how to arrange the furniture. Helena found herself falling more in love with him every day, charmed by his thoughtfulness and his quiet strength. He listened when she talked about her students, offered suggestions when she was frustrated, and made her laugh when she was tired. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, his hopes for the future, and the family he wanted to build with her. And every night when he left her at her door with a kiss that grew more reluctant each time, she counted the days until they would not have to say goodbye. The night before the wedding, Helena lay in her bed in the cottage for the last time, unable to sleep. She thought about her father, wishing he could be there to see her marry a good man. She thought about her mother, whose fairy tale book had traveled all this way to be part of Helena's own story. And she thought about the girl who had stepped off the stage coach 2 months ago, scared and alone, and how much had changed in such a short time. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, perfect autumn weather. Helena dressed in her white gown, her hair arranged in soft curls by Mrs. Miller, and looked at herself in the mirror with wonder. She looked happy, she realized. Truly, genuinely happy in a way she had not been since before her father got sick. The church was packed with what seemed like the entire population of Montezuma and the surrounding area. Helena walked down the aisle alone as she had no one to give her away, but she held her head high, clutching a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers. At the altar, Zach waited in his best suit, his eyes locked on her with an expression that made her breath catch. The ceremony was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zach kissed her with such tenderness that Helena felt tears slip down her cheeks. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, Mr. and Mrs. Zachary Young. The celebration at the Double R was joyous and loud, with music and dancing and more food than Helena had ever seen. She danced with Zach, with Mr. Randolph, with several of the ranch hands, and even with John Peterson, who had come with his mother and looked almost happy. People congratulated them, wished them well, and offered advice both practical and ridiculous. As the sun began to set, Zach pulled Helena away from the crowd and led her to the ranch house, which had been decorated with ribbons and flowers by the women of the community. Inside, someone had lit the lamps and left a cold supper on the table, along with a bottle of wine. "Alone at last," Zach said, closing the door behind them and pulling Helena into his arms. "Alone at last," Helena agreed, tilting her face up for his kiss. They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that left Helena breathless and amazed. Afterwards, lying in their bed with Zach's arms around her, she felt a completeness she had never known existed. This was what the fairy tales meant, she thought. Not the ball gowns and castles, but this feeling of being utterly known and cherished by another person. What are you thinking? Zach murmured, his breath warm against her hair. That I am glad I got on that stage, coach, Helena said. That I am glad I came to Montezuma. That I am glad you met me and said what you said. Let me be your happy ending. Zach smiled against her shoulder. Best thing I ever said. Best thing I ever heard, Helena agreed. They fell asleep wrapped in each other, and when Helena woke in the morning to sunlight streaming through the windows and Zach still beside her, she felt like she had stepped into one of her beloved stories and found it was real. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, but a happy one. Helena continued teaching, though she had to make the journey from the ranch to town each day, driven by Zach in good weather and by one of the ranch hands when he was too busy. The children thrived under her instruction, and she took pride in watching them learn and grow. She continued to read fairy tales during lunch, and the tradition became so popular that some of the parents asked if she would host a reading at the church one evening a month, open to the whole community. She agreed, and the monthly story hour became a beloved Montezuma tradition. At the ranch, Helena threw herself into making the house a home. She sewed curtains, planted a garden, learned to cook the hearty meals the ranch hands needed, and slowly transformed the austere ranch house into a place of warmth and welcome. Zach was busy with the responsibilities of running the ranch, but he always made time for her, always made her feel like the most important person in his world. In the spring, Helena discovered she was pregnant. The joy she and Zach felt was tempered only by her worry about continuing to teach, but she was determined to work as long as she could. The school board was understanding, and the women of Montezuma rallied around her, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. As her pregnancy progressed, Helena found she tired more easily, and by the end of the school year in May, she reluctantly admitted she needed to take a break from teaching. The school board hired a new teacher, a young woman from Denver, and Helena handed over her classroom with mixed feelings. But the prospect of the baby made up for the loss, and she focused on preparing for motherhood. In late August, Helena went into labor on a sweltering afternoon. Dorothy Randolph and the doctor attended her, with Zach pacing anxiously outside the bedroom. After 12 hours of hard labor, Helena gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's blue-green eyes and a shock of dark hair. They named him William, after Helena's father, and called him Will. Zach held his son with tears streaming down his face, and Helena watched them with a heart so full she thought it might overflow. This was her family, she thought. This was the happy ending she had stopped believing in, back when she was alone in Boston with only her books for company. Will was an easy baby, good-natured and healthy, and Helena marveled at the fierce love she felt for him. Zach was a devoted father, juggling ranch responsibilities with time spent with his son, and Helena fell even more in love with him watching him care for their child. As Will grew, the ranch prospered. Zach's hard work and smart management paid off, and he was able to start making payments to buy the double R from the Randolphs. The ranch hands respected him, the cattle thrived, and the future looked bright. When Will was 2, Helena discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less nervous, more confident, and she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. Grace had Helena's gray eyes and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone she met. The ranch house rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing, and Helena could not imagine a more perfect life. She still read fairy tales, now to Will and Grace, and they loved the stories as much as she always had. But she also told them true stories, about how she had come to Montezuma scared and alone, and how their father had offered to be her happy ending, and how they had built a life together through hard work and love. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Will grew tall and strong, helping his father on the ranch. Grace was curious and bright, always asking questions and exploring. Helena occasionally taught at the school when the regular teacher needed help, and she continued her monthly story hours at the church. Zach's hair began to show gray at the temples, and Helena found laugh lines around her eyes when she looked in the mirror, but they were happy signs of a life well lived. They had built something real and lasting, a partnership based on respect and love and shared dreams. When Will was 10 and Grace was 8, Helena gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Sarah after the students who had first asked her to read fairy tales all those years ago. The twins were energetic and mischievous, keeping Helena and Zach on their toes, but they were also a joy, completing their family in a way that felt right. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Zach surprised Helena by taking her back to the hilltop where he had first told her he loved her. The children were being watched by Dorothy Randolph, and for the first time in years, Helena and Zach had an afternoon to themselves. They stood at the top of the hill, looking out at the ranch spread below them, now fully theirs, paid off through years of hard work. "Do you remember the first time I brought you up here?" Zach asked, his arm around her waist. "Of course," Helena said, leaning into him. "You told me you did not have much to offer, that you were just a ranch foreman and not a prince from my stories." "I was a fool," Zach said. "I had everything to offer. I just did not know it yet." "You offered me a future," Helena said softly. "You offered me a home and a family and a love I had stopped believing was possible. That was everything, Zach." He turned to face her, his eyes still as blue-green and intense as they had been that first day. "You know what I think about when I look at you?" "What?" "I think about that scared woman on the stagecoach, reading fairy tales to herself, and I think about how grateful I am that I got to be part of your story. That I got to walk up to you and say, 'Let me be your happy ending,' and you were brave enough to say yes." He paused, then smiled. "Though I still maintain it is not an ending, it is everything in between." Helena laughed, the sound bright and free. "It is the middle of the story, the best part." "The best part," Zach agreed, and kissed her there on the hilltop, with the ranch spread below them and their children waiting at home and years of love stretching behind and ahead of them. That evening they gathered their children around the fireplace in the ranch house living room. The twins were supposed to be in bed, but they had crept downstairs and Helena did not have the heart to send them back. Will sat on the floor, whittling a piece of wood, and Grace curled up in the chair with a book, already showing signs of inheriting her mother's love of reading. "Tell us the story," Grace said, looking up from her book. "The true one about how you and Papa met." Helena glanced at Zach, who smiled and nodded. She had told this story countless times, but it never got old. "It was 1878, she began, "and I was 22 years old and more frightened than I had ever been in my life. My father had died, and I had no money and no prospects, so I took a position as a schoolteacher in a place called Montezuma in the New Mexico Territory, even though I had never been west of Pennsylvania." "And you came on a stagecoach," Samuel piped up. He had heard this story before. "I did. And I was so scared that I read my fairy tale book the entire way because those stories made me feel less alone." Helena smiled at the memory. "When I arrived in Montezuma, there was a cowboy waiting for me, the handsomest man I had ever seen." "That was Papa," Sarah said, grinning at her father. "That was your Papa," Helena confirmed, "and he helped me settle in and he was kind when I needed kindness. A few days later I was sitting in the schoolhouse, reading my fairy tales to myself, and he walked in and saw me." "And what did he say?" Grace asked, even though she knew the answer. Helena looked at Zach and he took over the story. I said, let me be your happy ending, because I already knew I loved her even though we had just met. Sometimes you just know. That is so romantic, Grace sighed. It is ridiculous, Will said, but he was smiling. You cannot fall in love with someone you just met. You can when it is the right person, Zach said firmly. Your mother was reading about princesses and princes and magical happy endings, and I wanted to show her that real life could be just as good. Better even, because it was real. And was it? Samuel asked. Better than the fairy tales. Helena looked around at her family, at the home they had built, at the life they had created together. She thought about all the years of laughter and tears, of hard work and simple joys, of children born and dreams realized. She thought about waking up every morning next to Zach and falling asleep every night in his arms. She thought about teaching students and reading stories and watching her children grow. Yes, she said simply, it was better. Because fairy tales end with happily ever after, but they do not tell you what that looks like. They do not tell you about the everyday magic of building a life with someone you love. They do not tell you about children who make you laugh and drive you crazy in equal measure, or about working together to build something that will last, or about the way love grows deeper and richer with time. That is a lot of words to say, yes, Will teased. Your mother likes words, Zach said, pulling Helena close. It is one of the many things I love about her. Later that night, after the children were finally asleep, Helena and Zach sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast New Mexico sky. Helena had her fairy tale book in her lap, its pages even more worn than they had been when she first arrived in Montezuma. You still read them? Zach asked, nodding at the book. Sometimes, Helena said. Mostly to the children now, but occasionally to myself when I want to remember. Remember what? Remember what it felt like to believe in magic, even when life was hard. Remember what it felt like to hope for a happy ending when everything seemed dark. Helena ran her fingers over the book's cover. These stories got me through some difficult times. They reminded me that good things were possible. And now, Zach asked softly. Now I do not need them the same way, Helena said. Because I am living the story I used to only read about, maybe not with a castle or a glass slipper, but with something better, something real. Zach took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles in the gesture that had become so familiar over the years. You know what I think? What? I think we should write our own fairy tale. The story of the schoolteacher and the cowboy who built a life in the Wild West. We could leave it for our children and their children, so they know where they came from. Helena smiled, charmed by the idea. What would we call it? How about she was reading fairy tales to herself? The cowboy said, "Let me be your happy ending," Zach suggested. That is a terrible title, Helena laughed. Far too long, maybe, but it is true. And that is what matters, is it not? The truth of it. Helena leaned her head on Zach's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Yes, she said. The truth of it is what matters. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and one of the horses whinnied in response. The wind rustled through the cottonwood trees and the scent of sage drifted on the air. You ever miss Boston? Zach asked after a while. No, Helena said without hesitation. Boston was my past. This is my home. You are my home. Good, Zach said, kissing the top of her head. Because I cannot imagine this place without you. Cannot imagine my life without you. You will never have to, Helena promised. I am not going anywhere. As the years continued to pass, the Young family became a cornerstone of the Montezuma community. Will grew into a fine young man who took over more and more of the ranch responsibilities, showing the same work ethic and integrity as his father. Grace pursued her love of learning, eventually becoming a teacher herself at the school where Helena had once taught. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, were inseparable and full of energy, always into some adventure or another. Helena watched her children grow with pride and a bittersweet awareness that time was passing. She and Zach were in their 40s now, no longer young but not yet old, and they had settled into a comfortable rhythm of life that felt both familiar and precious. When Will was 20, he fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sensible young woman named Emma who fit into the family as though she had always been there. Their wedding was a joyous occasion, held at the ranch, and Helena cried happy tears watching her son pledge his life to the woman he loved. A year later, Will and Emma gave Helena and Zach their first grandchild, a baby girl they named Helena after her grandmother. Holding her namesake in her arms, Helena was overwhelmed with emotion, marveling at the continuation of the family she and Zach had started. Grace eventually married a doctor who had come to Montezuma to practice, a kind and intelligent man who adored her. They settled in town, and Grace continued teaching while raising her own family. The twins went off to college, something that would have been unthinkable when Helena first arrived in New Mexico, but was now possible thanks to the prosperity the ranch had brought. Through it all, Helena and Zach remained devoted to each other. They still took walks together, still sat on the porch in the evenings, still found time to talk and laugh and simply be together. Their love had deepened over the years, becoming something solid and unshakable, the foundation on which everything else was built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was full of children and grandchildren, noise and laughter, and Helena stood in the kitchen, surveying the chaos with a full heart. Will was outside with his father and his own children, teaching them to rope the way Zach had taught him. Grace was helping set the table, her children underfoot. The twins had come home from college, full of stories and plans for the future. "Quite a family you have got there," Dorothy Randolph said, coming to stand beside Helena. She was elderly now, using a cane to get around, but her eyes were still sharp and kind. "You and Zach did good." "We did," Helena agreed, watching through the window as Zach laughed at something Will said, his face creased with smile lines and weathered by years of outdoor work, but still handsome to her. "We really did. I remember when he brought you to that first barn raising," Dorothy continued. "I told him then that you were special, that he should not let you get away." "I did not know that," Helena said, surprised. "Well, he did not need much convincing. He was already halfway in love with you." Dorothy smiled. "It has been a privilege watching your story unfold, Helena. You and Zach, you are proof that happy endings are real." "Not endings," Helena corrected gently. "Happy middles. Because the story keeps going, does not it? It does not stop just because you find love or build a life. It keeps going, changing and growing." Dorothy laughed. Spoken like a true teacher and a true romantic. The anniversary celebration was everything Helena could have wanted. The family gathered around the long table on the porch, laden with food and shared stories and laughter. The grandchildren clamored for Helena to read a fairy tale, and she obliged, pulling out her worn book and reading the tale of Cinderella while the children sat at her feet, enthralled. When she finished, her oldest grandchild, little Helena, looked up at her with serious eyes. "Grandma, which do you like better, the fairy tales or your real story?" Helena glanced at Zach, who was watching her with that same intense look he had given her 30 years ago. My real story, she said without hesitation, because in fairy tales you only get the highlights. The ball, the kiss, the happily ever after. But in real life, you get all the moments in between. The ordinary days that turn out to be extraordinary because you are sharing them with someone you love. The challenges you overcome together. The family you build. The home you create. That is better than any fairy tale. Even better than Cinderella. Little Helena looked skeptical. Even better than Cinderella, Helena confirmed. Because Cinderella just got a prince and a castle, I got something much more valuable. I got a partner, a family, a home, and a love that has lasted 30 years and will last the rest of our lives. That night, after the family had gone to bed and the house was finally quiet, Helena and Zach sat in their bedroom getting ready for sleep. Helena was brushing her hair, now liberally streaked with silver, when Zach came up behind her and took the brush from her hand. "Let me," he said, and began running the brush through her hair with gentle strokes, something he had done countless times over the years. "Do you remember the first time you brushed my hair?" Helena asked, watching him in the mirror. "I do. You had been sick with a fever and you were too weak to do it yourself. You were so embarrassed, but I told you that was what husbands were for." Zach smiled at the memory. "You have beautiful hair, even with the silver." "We are getting old," Helena said, not sadly but matter-of-factly. "We are," Zach agreed. "But I would not change a thing. Every gray hair, every wrinkle, every year that has passed has been worth it to be with you." Helena turned around and took his hands. "Zach Young, I need to tell you something." He looked alarmed. "What? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Helena assured him. "I just need to tell you that marrying you was the best decision I ever made. That you have made me happier than I ever imagined possible. That I love you more now than I did 30 years ago, which I would not have believed was possible back then." Zach pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I love you too, Helena. You are everything to me. You always have been." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, and Helena thought about the young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach all those years ago, scared and alone with only her fairy tales for comfort. If she could go back and tell that young woman what the future held, she would not believe it. The love, the family, the life they had built would seem too good to be true. But it was true. All of it. And that was the real magic. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and constancy in equal measure. Will took over complete management of the ranch, allowing Zach to step back into a more advisory role. He and Emma expanded the house, adding rooms for their growing family. Grace's children excelled in school, showing their mother's love of learning. The twins married and started families of their own. Helena, now in her late 50s, had slowed down but not stopped. She still read at the monthly story hours, now attended by a new generation of children. She still walked every day, though not as far as she once had. She still read her fairy tale book, though it was so worn that some of the pages had to be carefully turned to prevent them from falling out. Zach, in his early 60s, was still strong and capable, but he had finally agreed to let Will handle the heavy ranch work. He spent more time with Helena, and they enjoyed a quietness together that came from decades of companionship. They did not always need to talk, content to simply be in each other's presence. One spring evening, they took their usual walk up to the hilltop that had become their special place. The climb was harder now, and they stopped several times to rest, but the view at the top was as breathtaking as ever. "I have been thinking," Zach said as they stood looking out at the ranch, "about what happens when we are gone." Helena looked at him sharply. "That is a morbid thought." "Not morbid, practical." Zach squeezed her hand. "I want to make sure everything is in order for the children. The ranch goes to Will, of course, but I want to make sure Grace and the twins are taken care of too." You have already done that, Helena reminded him. We have met with the lawyer. Everything is settled. I know, but I also want to make sure you know how much you have meant to me, how much this life we have built has meant. Zach turned to face her fully. I was lost before you, Helena. Oh, I had work and purpose, but I was alone in a way that had nothing to do with being surrounded by people. You changed that. You gave me a reason to build something that would last, a reason to hope for the future instead of just enduring the present. Helena felt tears prick her eyes. You saved me too. I was so scared when I came here, so alone. You gave me everything. Love, family, a home, a purpose. You gave me a life worth living. We gave each other that, Zach corrected. That is what partnership is, building something together that neither could have built alone. They stood together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, and Helena thought about all the sunsets they had watched together over the years. Thousands of them, each one beautiful, each one shared. You think we will have many more years? Helena asked quietly. I hope so, Zach said, but however many we have, I will make sure every one counts. They did have more years, not as many as they might have hoped, but enough. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, with small joys and everyday miracles. Years of love and laughter and the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. When Helena was 68 and Zach was 71, he fell ill. It started as a bad cold that would not go away, then turned into pneumonia. Despite the doctor's best efforts and Helena's devoted nursing, Zach weakened quickly. The family gathered at the ranch, and Helena knew with a sinking heart that the end was near. She sat beside Zach's bed, holding his hand, watching him struggle to breathe. Their children were in and out of the room, but they had sense enough to give their parents time alone. I am sorry, Zach whispered, his voice barely audible. For what? Helena asked, leaning close. For leaving you. I promised you a happy ending, and now I am breaking that promise. Tears streamed down Helena's face. You did not promise me an ending. You promised me a middle, a life, and you gave me that. 46 years of the best middle anyone could ask for. Do not you dare apologize for that. Zach managed a weak smile. I love you, Helena Thatcher Young. From the moment I saw you on that stagecoach until this very moment and beyond, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. And you were the best thing that ever happened to me, Helena said, her voice breaking. You were my prince, my happy ending, my everything. Not an ending, Zach reminded her, his eyes closing. Never an ending, just the next chapter. He died that night peacefully with Helena holding his hand and their children surrounding the bed. Helena felt like part of her soul had been ripped away, the grief so intense it was physical. But even through the pain, she held onto the gratitude for all the years they had had, all the love they had shared, all the life they had built together. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire county. Zach had been well loved and respected, and people came from miles around to pay their respects. Will delivered a eulogy that had everyone in tears, speaking of his father's integrity, his kindness, and his devotion to his family. Helena sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and drew strength from them. In the days and weeks that followed, Helena had to learn how to live without Zach. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder even than leaving Boston all those years ago. The house felt empty without him, the bed too large, the mornings too quiet. But she had her family, and they rallied around her, making sure she was never alone for long. One evening, several months after Zach's death, Helena sat on the porch with her fairytale book in her lap. She had not opened it since Zach died, unable to bear the memories it would bring. But tonight, she felt ready. She opened to a random page and found herself reading a story about a princess who had to overcome great trials to find her happy ending. When she finished, she closed the book and looked out at the ranch, at the land she and Zach had worked together, at the legacy they had built. "You were right," she said aloud, as though Zach could hear her. It was not an ending. It was a middle, and what a beautiful middle it was. Grace came out onto the porch carrying 2 cups of tea. "Talking to Papa?" she asked gently, handing 1 cup to her mother. "I suppose I was," Helena said, accepting the tea. "Is that foolish?" "Not at all. I talk to him too sometimes." Grace sat beside her mother. "Mama, I have been thinking. You have been telling our family story for years, but you have never written it down. Do not you think you should? For the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, so they know where they came from." Helena considered the idea. "I would not know how to start." "Start at the beginning," Grace suggested. With a scared young woman on a stagecoach, reading fairy tales to herself, about to step into a life she could never have imagined. Helena smiled. And then a cowboy walked up to her and said, "Let me be your happy ending." "Exactly," Grace said. "That is the story, Mama. That is what people need to hear. Not just about the happy ending, but about everything in between. The love, the work, the family, the life. All of it." Helena thought about it as she sipped her tea, watching the sun set over the ranch. Maybe Grace was right. Maybe she should write it all down, preserve the story for future generations. It would be a way to honor Zach's memory, to celebrate the life they had built together. "I will think about it," Helena promised, and she did. In the months that followed, Helena began writing. She had always loved words, and the story poured out of her, page after page of memories and love and life. She wrote about meeting Zach, about their courtship and marriage, about the children and the ranch and the years of building something that would last. She wrote about the joys and the challenges, the laughter and the tears, the everyday magic of a life shared with someone you love. She wrote about fairy tales and reality, about princes and cowboys, about endings and middles, and the importance of hope even in dark times. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes grew tired, driven by the need to get it all down, to preserve it before the memories faded. When she finally finished, months later, she had a thick stack of pages, the story of her life with Zach written out in her neat, careful handwriting. She read through it, making small changes and additions, and when she was satisfied, she gathered her family together. They met at the ranch house on a Sunday afternoon, all of Helena's children and grandchildren, and even some of the great-grandchildren. Helena stood before them, the manuscript in her hands, suddenly nervous. "I have written something," she said. "The story of your grandfather and me, how we met and fell in love and built this life together. I want you all to have it, to read it and remember, and maybe someday to share it with your own children and grandchildren." Will stood and took the manuscript from her, his eyes already misty. "Thank you, Mama. This means everything. Your father used to say that our story was better than any fairy tale," Helena said, her voice thick with emotion. "And he was right. Because fairy tales give you the highlights, but real life gives you everything in between. And that in between, that middle where you build and love and live, that is where the real magic is." She lived for several more years, long enough to see more great-grandchildren born, long enough to attend Grace's 50th anniversary celebration, long enough to see the ranch continue to prosper under Will's management. She remained active in the community, still reading at story hours, still walking when she was able, still finding joy in the small moments. But she missed Zach with an intensity that never faded. Every sunset reminded her of the ones they had watched together. Every walk to the hilltop made her wish he was beside her. Every night when she climbed into bed, she felt the absence of him like a physical ache. Still, she did not despair. She had had 46 years with the love of her life, had built a family and a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. She had lived a story better than any fairy tale, had experienced love and loss and everything in between. And when her time came, she would go peacefully, knowing she had lived well and loved deeply. Helena died in her sleep one spring night, just shy of her 75th birthday. She went peacefully, without pain or fear, and her family took comfort in knowing she was reunited with Zach. They buried her beside him on the hilltop they had loved, under a sky so blue it seemed to go on forever. At the funeral, we'll read from the manuscript his mother had written, the story of the schoolteacher and the cowboy who had built a life in the Wild West. There was not a dry eye in the crowd as he read about Zach approaching Helena in the schoolhouse and saying those fateful words, "Let me be your happy ending." But he was not her ending, Will said, closing the manuscript, and she was not his. They were each other's beginning, each other's middle, each other's everything in between. They built a life together based on love and respect and partnership, and they left us all a legacy of what real love looks like. Not the fairy tale version, but the real one, the one that lasts. Years passed, and the Double R Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations of Youngs. Helena's story, our tradition, continued in Montezuma, now run by her great-granddaughter. The manuscript she had written was carefully preserved, read by each new generation, a reminder of where they came from and the love that had started it all. And on the hilltop where Helena and Zach were buried, wildflowers grew every spring, bright and beautiful, a natural monument to a love that had transcended time and circumstance. Visitors to the ranch would sometimes climb the hill and stand there, looking out at the view, and understand why this place had been special to the couple who had built the ranch into what it was. The story of Helena and Zach became something of a legend in Montezuma, told and retold until it took on the quality of a fairy tale itself. But it was better than a fairy tale, because it was true. Two people had found each other in the vastness of the New Mexico territory, had built a life together through hard work and devotion, and had loved each other until death parted them and beyond. It was a story about hope and courage, about taking chances and believing in happy endings even when life was hard. It was a story about the difference between being rescued and choosing to stand beside someone, about the everyday magic of building something that would last. It was a story about a woman reading fairy tales to herself and a cowboy who said, "Let me be your happy ending." And it was a story that would continue to inspire long after both of them were gone, a reminder that the best stories are not the ones we read, but the ones we live. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Helena and Zach were together again, still building their story, still loving each other, still proving that the best fairy tales are the ones that are real.